Hello, welcome back to the Sci-Fi Reading Podcast. I am science fiction author Kate Sheeran Swed, and today is the final episode of Season 1 when I am finishing up my reading of Outlaw Rising, a science fiction novella. And wow, that went by fast. It's a very short book. As always, if you have not seen the previous episodes, you will want to go back and catch up on the story. A couple of brief notes because this is the very last episode of the first season. I have plans to go live tomorrow evening as this goes out. That would be March 17th, 2023 at 8 p.m. Eastern. I have been making grand promises for this to be on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, but I'm having some technical difficulties with that. I thought that I might not be able to do it, and then I thought I could, and now it seems I really can't. So my solution is I'm going to go live on Instagram. That is the social media platform before YouTube that I've been the most present on. So I'm going to go live on Instagram at 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to answer your questions, and then I will do my very best to get that video loaded up onto YouTube with all of the answers. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments or in the show notes. There's a link to a Google form. You can drop them there. If you are dying for this to go live on YouTube, please leave a comment to that effect, and I can't do everything, but I'll see what I can do to fix it. I'm sorry about that. This is a learning process, and so that is an excellent segue into the next point that I want to make, which is I'm having a ton of fun with this. I am so excited to continue, and if you're with me right here at the beginning, I'm sure you've noted that learning process. As such, there is a very good chance that in the future, I'm almost certain, I'm going to be re-recording Outlaw Rising. I had mic issues in the beginning. I'd like to kind of reset my studio a little bit so that it's the sound is a little bit better. And I have been improving, I think, with my reading skills over the course of this. So if there was something that you absolutely loved about this season, or some of the commentary, or if you're just dying to have this preserved somewhere, please leave a comment so that I know that and I can, try to accommodate that. You're here from the beginning with me, and I just can't say how much I appreciate that. So, a few changes. I'm going to be changing the title to the sci-fi reading series with Kate Sheeran Swed. It'll just make it a little bit easier to find, a little clearer what it actually is. And I'm also going to be taking all of the commentary that I kind of interrupted the story with and moving that to the very end of each episode. So that way people can either skip to it if they want to just hear that, or they can listen to the chapters uninterrupted by this commentary. I think that because I do more of a straight read and I don't do voices and things like that because I'm not a narrator, I'm the author, it's still in my interpretation of the chapters and everything. I think that it's a little bit difficult to tell when I'm doing the commentary and all of that. So I'm going to be moving those to the end, but I still will be doing them and probably planning them out a little bit more instead of just off the cuff, which was also fun to do. So next week, I'm going to be posting a short story from the Parse Galaxy universe. It will stand on its own. It's called Highly Irregular. If you'd like to read that first, you can join my newsletter. It's at katesheeranswed.com, and it's in a PDF there. If you join my newsletter, you will get you can get the ebook, not just the PDF. And then after that, there'll probably be a brief break of a week or two. And then I will start on reading Chaos Zone, which is book 1, and it directly follows the events of Chaos Zone. It's also an entry point into the series, so hopefully I can get better at this, and you can tell your friends about how awesome it is, and we will all continue reading science fiction together, hoping to build, a fun conversation and community here. So again, thank you so much for being here, and now that I'm done yammering, let's get on with the chapters. Chapter 11. As much time as Sloane had spent on Moneymaker over the years, its in-flight sounds were still new to her. Hums and thrums and a full suite of random clanks. She wasn't much for space travel, all things being equal, but it all seemed pretty normal. A little clunky maybe, but safe. Sort of. She wasn't the kind of girl who fell in love with ships. She knew those girls, even envied them in a way. The light in their eyes when they discussed engines and weight distribution and navigation was undeniable, and respectable to boot, but she wasn't one of them. She didn't understand their love of oil and pistons, or whatever it was they focused on when they were stuffed under the hood of a space rig. All things considered, though, Moneymaker was a pretty decent little star schooner. Not luxurious by any standards, but passable. Sloane didn't have much stuff to collect from her cabin, which she'd barely seen over the past couple of days, except for the brief hours she'd spent sleeping. So she found herself drifting up toward the pilot's deck. Even as tired as she was, sleep was an impossibility. Adrenaline still pumped through her veins when she thought about how close the fleet had come to recapturing her, how easily Commander Fortune could have called her bluff. She'd never have been able to drop the sculpture, and if he'd tested her on that, she'd be in a fleet cell right now. It was hard to get past something like that. She'd expected everyone else to be resting, but as she made her way through the silent kitchen, she could hear voices echoing through the sparse pantry that bridged the gap between the flight deck and the kitchen. And they weren't just any voices. That was her father's voice. Sloane ignored approximately 4,000 calls from him over the past few hours, a definite indication that the scene she'd made with the Skraler had gone viral by now. She hadn't been able to face a glance at the network, not yet, but she could picture it well enough. There'd been a lot of people at that party. They probably had a video of her hugging that sculpture, and from a dozen angles, too. Sloane had heard her father yell before. He tended to be more of the lecturing type, but she'd merited shouting on several occasions, and now, as she paused in the doorway, Vin was the one taking the brunt of her father's rage. Dad's face took up half the view screen, obscuring the stars and making him look bigger, more threatening than ever. Vin could have turned him into a thumbnail with the tap of a finger. Why didn't he? I had to beg to get her back into that school, Dad was saying. She doesn't need your rectum-searing influence, Vin. She's hanging on by a thread as it is. True. So true. So we probably knew about the incident with the Javan adhesive and the medical equipment by now, too. For her father to use a word like rectum in one of his made-up swears, yeah, he was pissed. Sloane realized she was holding her breath, waiting for Vin's response. Her father's was predictable enough, but what would her uncle say? Nothing, as it turned out. Vin simply swiped his fingers, and Dad disappeared from the viewport. He kept staring at it, though, as if he could see his brother's face there fuming at him. Sloane knew the feeling. You'd think I was 5, she said, instead of 30. Vin picked up a drink at his elbow. She hadn't noticed it before, and tossed back the brown liquid. Yeah, well, that's your dad. And I thought you were 29. His tone sounded casual enough, but his shoulders were slumped. They'd succeeded in their mission, and yet he seemed defeated. Seemed different, Sloane said. There was a brief silence, and she used it to gather her courage to form the question that had been knocking at the back of her head since she'd escaped in the manor garden. So why don't you tell him? Vin set the glass down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and swiveled the pilot's seat halfway around so he could meet her eye. With her father's face gone from the viewport, the vista was like a smeared impression of blue-green haze. They must be in the current, then. Sloane shifted her gaze back to her uncle. That you're not a criminal at all. You work for the Cosmic Trade Federation, right? It was a little comical to see her uncle's eyes widen with such obvious surprise. She didn't know what his actual Federation title was, but he definitely wasn't used to spying or covert operations, or whatever they called it. His surprise gave way to a smile, one that dented his cheek with that famous tarnished dimple. You're impressive, kid. You know that, right? Sloane patted her hair. Why, yes, I do. Vin sobered, holding her gaze. There's a place for you on my crew, you know, if you want it. Moneymaker hummed beneath her feet, beneath the fingertips that grazed the edge of the doorway, and in a place between her ribs that she couldn't quite name. But she knew without a doubt that if the engine shifted, if the vibrations were to cease, she'd feel the change. The place smelled like his whiskey, like cedar-planked cargo crates, like chocolate and copper, and somehow the fresh bite she associated with oncoming snow. It smelled like adventure. It felt like home. I can't. Sloane didn't quite realize she'd formed the words until they came out, quiet but firm, not even a tremble. I gotta be respectable. Vin held on to his smile, as best he could, she thought, though some of the spark left his eyes, and nodded. If he could read the conflict in her eyes, in her voice, he didn't show it. I figured. We're exiting the current in 5. I'll drop you at Elter's Orbit's transfer station. Right. Sloane hesitated, and he held out his hand to shake hers. She took it, then pulled him up out of his chair and into a hug. Thanks for the help, kid, he said. She let go, and he gave her head an awkward pat. Before she could blurt out that she really did want to stay, that she changed her mind, that she'd deal with Dad and school and everything, she whirled around and hurried out the door. My husband's walking around upstairs. I can't tell if it's registering on the microphone or not. Yeah. I'm in the basement, and he's right above my head. So, again, kind of need to get a little bit of a better setup here. Okay, I don't mean to interrupt the reading. As her feet left the spiral staircase and landed in cargo, Moneymaker made the brief telltale lurch that told her it had left the current. She stumbled slightly, and Hilda appeared as if out of nowhere to grab her elbow and steady her. It was dark down here and chilly. The pilot didn't sleep down here, did she? Sorry if I startled you, Hilda said. Sometimes I smoke down here when I can't sleep. The place did smell faintly of smoke, though the pilot didn't have a roll in her hand, and the flowery aroma was faint enough that she must have finished her last one some time ago. Her green parakeet was with her this time, and it twisted in a tight circle above her, before landing on the rail of the staircase to peer curiously at Sloane. Glad you were there, Sloane said. I'd be on my ass otherwise. Hilda gave her a thin smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She didn't look angry, just concerned maybe. Moneymaker slowed, and something under Sloane's feet clunked with a finality that only came with landing. The gangplank started to drop, and Sloane did her best to return the smile. Not easy, since it was kind of a weird smile. Okay, well, thanks, Sloane said. I'll see you around. Hilda pressed her lips together, then gave a tiny nod. Though not, Sloane thought, in answer to the question, as if she'd decided something. It wasn't Xander who got you into med school in the first place, Hilda said. It was Vin. He insisted they look at your records more closely, your projects and extracurriculars, rather than just your grades. Vin did? Sloane asked. The pilot fluttered her fingers. All right, he got someone in the CTF to do it. Same thing. No inside track, no guaranteed admission, nothing like that, just a second look at what he knew was already there. The gangplank finished its descent with a groan and a clank, and Sloane hesitated. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Hilda rolled a shoulder back. It might have been a shrug. I just thought you should know. The pilot reached a finger into the air and froze, and Sloane briefly considered whether she was supposed to return some kind of fringe system salute or something. But then the parakeet landed on Hilda's finger, and Sloane was glad she hadn't tried. Good luck, kid, Hilda said. The pilots headed up the spiral staircase, parakeet in hand, and disappeared. Sloane took one final breath of Moneymaker air, then stepped onto the gangplank and back into her real life. Chapter 12. A handful of hours back into the current, away from Elter and his brother, not to mention the trouble he'd caused his niece, Vin sat in his cabin staring at the data key Sloane had retrieved from the sculpture. It was still dusted with a light layer of plaster, and he rubbed absently at the input threads to dispel the last of it. They were heading toward the outer systems, though the Federation had yet to tell him exactly where he was meant to drop the data key. They'd tell him when he exited the current, though the only direction they'd given him was to enter regular space as soon as he reached the southwest quadrant of the outer systems. It always made him laugh the way they used cardinal directions to describe slices of space, as if it could transfer. But the center systems defined the maps, they defined the standard maps anyway, and their maps showed a top-view picture of the galaxy. Again, by their definition. Vin sighed. Exiting somewhere in the southwest quadrant could mean days, even weeks of regular-speed space travel. Even with Moneymaker sporting the fastest T-drive on the market, it would be a long trip. Or the Federation would have him dodging in and out of the currents to lose any tail he might have picked up. Different tactic, same result, extended space travel. He didn't mind, really, but he'd expected them to want the data as soon as possible. Clearly, they'd prioritize security over speed. And, like the fleet, they didn't want the information sent over any network. Fair enough. The problem was, Vin was curious. And the longer he took to deliver this thing, the more tempting it would be to take a peek at what it contained. Vin turned the data key over in his hand, running a fingertip along the narrow edge. Such a tiny chip to cause so much trouble. It was a wonder that Sloane had managed to palm it in the first place, the fake as it turned out, let alone work out where the Fox Clan operative had hidden the real one. Maybe he could change her mind. Maybe if he came clean to Xander, told him what he really did, her father would let her come along without complaint. But no. Even if the Federation would allow that, Xander would never see Vin's work as respectable. Oh, he might stop threatening to call the authorities. That was a big might. But Vin wasn't sure he'd ever lived up to his brother's expectations. Besides, Sloane needed to follow her own path. If Vin broke her free of her father's influence, she'd only feel beholden to him. She was young. She'd figure it out for herself. He still didn't know why the Fox Clan had wanted this information so badly that they'd risked a fleet ball to get it. It was true that any intel they could prove the fleet's power grab would be well worth having. But the clans didn't usually steal anything unless they could sell it, or unless someone had paid them an enormous bounty to retrieve it, and off the Federation's books, too. Not just retrieve it in this case, retrieve it and wipe it, leaving the fleet without solid evidence to back up their own intel. He didn't have a solid guess. Politics weren't Vin's specialty. He worked for the Federation, yes, but as a bounty hunter. He found people who didn't want to be found, and secrets they'd hidden away in dark recesses. It wasn't so different sometimes than the mercenary career his brother thought he followed. Vin was a thug and a con man, not a spy, not a politician. He'd squared with that truth a long time ago. Though he might not be skilled in political maneuvers, he had been hopping around the galaxy for decades now, and something about this whole thing felt off. The Fox Clan, the middleman, the Skrailer, all of it. Still fingering the data key, Vin opened the middle drawer of his desk, rifling through discarded tech and scraps of wire with a free hand until he found the one he was looking for. A long, unused flip tab, one that no longer connected to any network. It was old enough to make a technophile laugh, and slow as a tug ship in a gravity well. And it would tell him exactly what the data key contained. And finally, Chapter 13. 1 year later. Whatever medical specialty Sloane eventually landed in, it most definitely would not be limb regeneration, or organ regeneration, or anything that needed to grow painstakingly out of a few cedar cells. And pain was the operative part of that, since regeneration hurt like a finger in a socket, and drugs slowed down the process. It was quick, usually taking only a few days, but it was also utterly ruthless. After a double shift in the ward, she wanted a long, hot shower and music loud enough to make her neighbors bang on the door. Nothing less would drown out the memory of those pained cries. As she left the hospital and headed for the library courtyard, she tried to think of ways to get Professor Camden to let her focus on gene therapy in the next rotation. She hadn't caused any trouble in the last 6 months, unless you counted the fountain bot incident, which she didn't, and with a little begging, she thought he might give in. "Hey," someone called as she started to cut across the courtyard. "It's the Skrailer hugger. What's up?" Sloane didn't slow because she didn't know the person. She never did when they called her Skrailer hugger or art thief or party crasher. Those were among the nicer names. She didn't even roll her eyes at them anymore or duck her head. She just waved and continued across the grass. They'd done a good job of patching this place up, grass and all. She couldn't even see the spot where Moneymaker had landed just over a year ago. The trees along the path to her right, well, those were a little worse for the wear, but the branches were starting to come back in, and the trunks only showed a few singe marks. Except for the baby tree they'd planted to replace the one whose trunk had cracked in half, it looked pretty much as it always had. She hadn't heard from Vin since he dropped her on the Elter Orbit station. It was probably better that way, really, though she thought about him just about every day. She should work up her nerve to ask if Dad had heard from him at all. Enough time had passed to keep his curses in the tame zone, probably. A call blinked across her eye screen, flashing the blue spiral of the university origin, so Sloane accepted it. Yes, ma'am, a voice said as though continuing a conversation. Just calling to inform you that your ship is now docking in your hangar. Sloane paused, and a ball whooshed perilously close to her face. She hadn't even noticed anyone had been playing out here. They wouldn't have aimed at her on purpose. Surely not. There's been a mistake, she said absently as a student with a long blonde ponytail dove after the ball. She had to be imagining the spots of red on the girl's cheeks. They hadn't been aiming at her, had they? I don't have a hangar. Yes, you do. It's in your name. Sloane sighed and started walking again, picking up the pace, just in case another ball should accidentally swoop in her direction. AI admins were all well and good, but they had a tendency to mix people up upon occasion. If you could just... You are Sloane Tarnish, correct? It was definitely an AI with that too pleasant voice. There really wasn't a reason to be particularly polite to AI admins, especially when they interrupted, but she still felt the urge to be patient. Yes, she said. Ship hangar G45 has been registered in your name since you began your studies here 2.54 years ago, correct? No, yes, I did start 2.54 years ago, I guess, but I don't have a ship. The ship that's landing is tagged as belonging to you. Great. Another mistake, she was sure. Obviously, it was Vin. This was 100% a Vin move, but the AI had to be confusing his tag with hers. Fine, she said. I'll be right there. Thank you for your business. The voice's cheer didn't match the situation at all. The call cut off, and Sloane sighed again as she cut away from her apartment building and the siren song of the shower. The hangars were on the other side of campus, lodged in a pristine building that was almost as nice as Sloane's apartment building. With sleek white sides and an artistically curved blue roof, it seemed pretty clear that the university welcomed donors and VIPs from this section of campus. Sloane scanned her palm at the door, and a strip of arrows blinked across the floor to lead her to the hangar bay. They had them at the hospital, of course, but she hadn't imagined the hangar would be big enough to require it. She had imagined incorrectly. The place was enormous, enough to rival the spaceport at the heart of Elter City. A spiraling walkway led her past a suite of smaller bays and into the center, the ceiling yawning open above her head and letting the sunshine spill across the white and blue tiles. Finally, the arrows pointed her to a set of double doors stamped with the university's logo. Another palm scan, and they parted with a gentle huff of air. The bay was hers. Vin really had planned ahead. She'd have to smack him on the shoulder for that when she saw him, as soon as she hugged him. No more adventures, though. No heists, parties, or eagle-eyed fleet commanders. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she was already starting to smile. Hilda was pacing outside the moneymaker when Sloane arrived, braid thumping against her back as she walked, smoking one of her flowery cigarettes. To Sloane's surprise, Alex was also outside the ship. She sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked as if she'd been weeping. Moneymaker's gangplank was up. It looked like it had been powered down. What's going on? Sloane asked. What are you doing here? What we're doing here? Hilda was pacing, her hands trembling. Sloane caught sight of her parakeet, which was hopping along the nose of the ship and pecking at the glass viewport like it wanted to get in. What we're doing here? That is an excellent question. Sloane waited, wondering if she ought to offer the pilot a drink or maybe a sedative. Hilda flung her arm out toward the ship, flicking her hand so hard that Sloane winced. The ship flew us here and then it locked us out and informed us that you are the owner and it won't fly without your DNA key. Sloane blinked. Her brain felt sluggish, like she wasn't putting the pieces together quickly enough. Dread pooled in her stomach, but she tried to push it away. She was just tired after her long ship and surprised, confused. That can't be right. No, it can't. Hilda ground the words out from between her teeth while glaring at Sloane like this was her fault, like it had anything to do with her. Well, it didn't. It couldn't. We'll fix it, Sloane said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Where's Vin? Alex buried her face in her arms and let out a sob. Hilda stopped pacing, turning so Sloane could see her eyes were rimmed and red, her cheeks streaked with tears. She'd been crying, too. Vin disappeared, she said. He's in danger, Sloane, and we need your help to save him. That is it for Outlaw Rising. I really hope that you have enjoyed the reading. Remember, I'm going live on the 17th. That is tomorrow at 8 p.m. if you're watching this as it goes out, only on Instagram. I'm on Instagram at Kate Sheeran Swed. If you have any questions, please leave them for me, and I will do everything I can to get that video up on YouTube. I do apologize for that. I'm going to try to make things a little bit smoother going forward, and thank you so much for listening. Make sure you do subscribe to the channel and hit the alarm bell so that you don't miss when I start Chaos Zone. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you soon.